Dr. Jessie Cavanaugh is a Harvard-trained clinical researcher with over 20 years of experience in natural health. She established Franklin Health Research, now known as Nutraceuticals Research Institute since 2005, as an independent educational center. As the president of this boutique clinical research organization specializing in nutraceuticals, dietary supplements, and natural products, she oversees the academically focused clinical research. She is a widely published researcher in the integrative health field and frequently travels to present research findings from the Franklin Health team at professional conferences. Dr. Cavanaugh has conducted research studies, including the aromatic plant ingredients and child health study, which is a 3-stage epidemiological study assessing lavender, tea tree, and hormonal disorders in children. That was a huge one that we are continuing to say thank you so much for giving us that information so we can keep educating, because some people read a study and they think that's it, but we're here to show them, no, there's more. Bergamo is another study for medical office-induced anxiety with children with autism spectrum disorder, aromatherapy to reduce fatigue among women with hypothyroidism. So today she is sharing research update for aromatherapy for kids' respiration health, aromatherapy for seasonal stress among children with autism spectrum disorder. We are extremely lucky and extremely honored to have Dr. Jessie Cavanaugh.
Hi, everybody. Really good to see everyone's faces, all my familiar friends and colleagues' faces, and a lot of new faces. So that's always exciting when we see new faces this year. A lot of you know me as Jessie Hawkins. It's been a big year for me. I have a new name, but I have the same qualifications, the same financial disclosures, the same everything else, just a new last name. And so for full transparency, I always like to start out with, there's my list of degrees related to what I'm going to talk to you about today and my financial disclosures. I do work for the natural products industry, essential oil companies and botanical product companies from all over the world, specifically to conduct high quality clinical trials on their products. We also provide continuing education for healthcare professionals. It's always been a passion of mine, after we get that information from those studies, to disseminate it as quickly as possible. Because we know there's a big lag between conducting a research study, getting it published into the literature, and then communicating it and getting it actually out there in practice. So that's always been a big goal of mine, is sort of condensing that, shortening that process so we can get it into practice almost immediately. So those are the different things that we do. There we go. And what that does, being able to have this kind of as my day job, allows me to also have the opportunity to do things like partner with NAHA. So we're able to kind of not only take these studies that we conduct on specific products or specific ingredients to answer specific questions for a for-profit business, but we're able to work within the community and actually dive deep into some of these research questions that tend to be neglected or ignored, or maybe don't have as much financial gain to get at the end. Maybe it's just for the purpose of the field or for the purpose of education. So with that, we love partnering with NAHA, first of all, because of the innovative approach that the board takes to research. We don't shy away from a lot of the more controversial topics, a lot of the heavier topics, such as the prepubertal gynecomastia study. We take those, we dive into them head on, and we're able to do all of this at cost. So it's a way that we can also help to give back to the community and really take this field to the next level. So that's what we do. You can see over here on the presentations on the wall some of the past NAHA work that we've done, a lot of the clinical trials that we've done. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about that we do, and I know the NAHA board is as well, is again targeting these questions and these research areas that nobody else really wants to touch, like prepubertal gynecomastia. That was a big one. We also dive into other topics, though, like clinical trials on pregnant women. Pregnant women are using essential oils, so we need to have clinical research on them. You'll also notice a lot of the studies over there, and the studies we're going to talk about today are clinical trials on children. And I always like to start out with that. Anytime I tell anyone we conduct clinical trials on children, one of the first things they say is, why kids? And then one of the next things they say, actually the more common version of it is, you can't do that. You're not supposed to do that, right? And my scientifically trained brain is kind of perpetually in the state of a 5-year-old. Why? Why can't we do that? And you kind of run through this cycle of, you're not supposed to do that. Why? Oh, well, they're children. Okay, why? Okay, well, it's scary, it's dangerous. And what we ultimately get to is that we have a lot of people who are very comfortable using essential oils with children and not researching it. So if it's ethical to be using natural products with children, if it's safe and fine to be administering essential oils to children, why is it not safe or fine to be collecting data on that and either confirming or improving our methods so that we can make it safer, so that we can make it more effective, so that we can make the overall practice better? And that is the approach that we take. And we can see, I'm actually going to skip that one. We can actually see this in practice, not just in our own field, but we can see this throughout the entire field of medicine. And I know you guys have, those of you that have heard me speak before, have heard me harp on this before. But when we look at the overall history of clinical research on children, for the most part, they've been neglected. In fact, for the most part, throughout the entire history of any sort of clinical research, unless you are a middle-aged white man of average weight, you were neglected. We kind of took this one baseline, conducted all of our studies on that, and then generalized it to everyone else. We decided this will work on women too, this will work on children too, this will work on other races, this will work on the elderly, and we started just generalizing. And then we found out very quickly that that doesn't work. You can't just take research on one population and try and assign it to another population. One of the biggest examples that we have of that was actually at my alma mater at Harvard, the Physicians' Health Study, where they told everyone to go take a baby aspirin every day and it's going to prevent a heart attack. And that was great. It was a really big study. It's a really big finding for preventive medicine. It was on men. So after enacting that advice for a while, we found out not only does this not work on women, it actually leads to adverse effects. So we had to correct it and come back and say, hey, ladies, don't do this thing that we told you to do. This only helps men. It doesn't help women. And we see that a lot. We see that with a lot of pharmaceuticals that are approved primarily in male populations. When we start giving the same medication to women or to children, side effects increase, efficacy decreases. We see that particularly when we're looking at children. And we've known this for a few decades now. It was in the 80s that children were first called therapeutic orphans, essentially meaning we're putting drugs on the market. We don't know what they do. We're going to assume it's probably fine. We're going to tone down the dose a little bit, and we're going to go from there, and it'll probably work out. As time passed, and we started being able to really quantify whether or not it worked out, what we've ended up with is that very last figure I want to bring your attention to, that relative risk of 3.44. That is the risk of side effects when off-label drugs are used for children as compared to drugs that have actually been studied in children. When we're looking at something like that, that's a ratio. So you want to see it as close to 1 as you can. 1 would mean it's the same risk. It'd be great if it was actually lower. 3.44 is 344% the risk when we're using those off-label drugs in children. And this is just in the pharmaceutical industry. When we look at how many kids are using essential oils, we have pre-pandemic data that shows over a third of kids in the United States are exposed to natural products in some way or another. Since the pandemic, that number's risen to over 50%. Of the natural products that kids are using, essential oils are some of the most common. They tend to be seen as the most safe. They tend to be seen as the most gentle, the most pediatric appropriate. So we have a lot of kids who are out here using essential oils. And we don't have a lot of actual hard evidence to draw from to make these recommendations. we're still treating them a little bit like therapeutic orphans. And just as an example, when we were getting ready to conduct the study that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, what we did was we went ahead and started conducting a meta-analysis. And that's a common research step. Anytime you're getting ready to embark on a new study or to dig into a new topic, the first thing you want to do is look at what already exists. We don't want to replicate what already exists. We want to build on it. We want to use that to inform what we're doing. So we did a review and a meta-analysis of what exists in the literature. When you go into the scientific literature and you want to pull essential oil or aromatherapy clinical trials on children, that number is in the double digits. That's it. In the entire world, all of the clinical trials, good, bad, ugly, whatever, that's it. In fact, it's in the lower double digits. The bulk of them have to do with pain and anxiety. They're pre-procedural pain and anxiety. A lot of them are dental care. What that tells me is these are convenience studies. These are people who are, they've already got kids together in a practice. They're looking at things they can do in the practice. They're not necessarily trained clinical researchers. They're not necessarily focused on methodology. They just have a population of kids available, and they're going to start collecting some data. Over half of the clinical trials that you'll find on kids and essential oils have to do with pre-procedural pain and anxiety, again, mostly with dental care. There's a couple of post-operative nausea and vomiting studies as well. So these are, again, kids in a medical center undergoing a procedure. A lot of these are using ginger, as we would anticipate. Most of them are inhalation. And then we have a little collection of miscellaneous studies. And here we have 1 to 2 studies per topic for an assortment of different things, ranging from sleep to headaches, a couple on burns, 1 on eczema, just a little kind of hodgepodge of studies. That is the entirety of the clinical literature for aromatherapy in children. It's worse than that, though. So when we sit down to do a meta-analysis, when we looked at, first of all, to do a meta-analysis, which is when you're doing a review, you take all of the information that you have available and you summarize it. You do a narrative review. By default, that's going to be a little bit subjective, because no matter how hard you try to be objective, you're going to be narrating the literature. Just like the brief overview that I just gave you is, you're going to hear my preference for methodology in the background of that. A meta-analysis gives you a more objective overview of it. So it's where you're taking all of the data that you have, you're extracting all the numbers from those trials and you're putting them together. So you can only do that when you have a collection of trials. So for that larger topic, the pre-procedural anxiety, we can conduct a meta-analysis on it. So when we sat down to do that, to kind of group it all together, take it to the next level, see what do we actually have here to prepare for this next set of studies that we're doing, we had a total of 8 studies that qualified for inclusion. That means they were on the same topic, they collected the same type of data, they were actually on a pediatric population, they actually did use essential oils versus saying so and then not, that kind of stuff. We evaluated standardized mean differences, which is just the numbers, the outcomes that we have. Heterogeneity, which looks at the similarity of the studies. Potential publication bias, which is a big deal when you see any group of studies that have an abnormally large number of positive outcomes and you're not really seeing negative outcomes. And methodological quality. Over half of those studies had substantial methodological issues. Substantial. And I am not just saying that as a methodological snob, although I fully admit to being one. I'm talking egregious errors. I'm talking failure to collect baseline data so that then you're collecting your outcome data and you can't even evaluate the change when we're looking at a subjective outcome. So if I'm going to talk to you about your anxiety level, I can't make a decision about your anxiety tomorrow if I didn't know about your anxiety today so that I can compare whether or not it changed. If you don't have that, you can't say anything has changed if you don't have that baseline. P-hacking, which is basically when it's lying with statistics, basically. It's basically when you start running a whole lot of tests until you find something that's statistically significant and you go, I got it, and you publish it, look, we found this significant effect. But by default, when we're looking at statistics, we're looking at probabilities, which means you're going to have a couple of false positives in there. So if you're digging through a pile and you find one and you pull it out and you negate all the rest, it's lying with statistics. It's p-hacking. There's also poorly defined inclusion criteria, failure to even acknowledge what oils they were using, common names in scientific publications with no botanical name even listed. Some of them didn't really explain how they were conducting the intervention. Just a lot of methodological issues. There were a total of 350 kids represented here. So we do have a fair number of children, and these are in the control or the intervention groups. But even then, when we start looking at trying to group these together and figure out, is there some sort of effect? The inhalation period for these studies ranged from 3 minutes to 60 minutes. So again, we're all over the board here with what we have. And trying to group this together and trying to come to some sort of scientific consensus here and say, what do these studies collectively tell us? What we really get, the overarching message is that we do have some efficacy here. A lot of the studies had positive results. When you group it together, you do have a net positive result. As you would imagine, inhaling lavender has a calming effect. We're all shocked to find that out. But really what we're seeing here, really what the message here is, we're eating from the trash when we try and conduct a meta-analysis with these studies, and that should not be, especially when we're talking about one of our most vulnerable populations. We shouldn't be eating from the trash. We should have good quality information that we can pull from here. And then we also have a complete lack of information about all of these other topics. When we talk about how we can use essential oils with kids, we have a lot that we know from case studies, a lot that we know from experience, but putting it together and quantifying it, determining how much of this is placebo effect and how much of this is attributable to the oil, which dosage is better to be giving, which, a diffusion method or exposure method or duration is going to give us the biggest effect. We got nothing. So that is really the issue that we see here. That's really the takeaway that we got from here. And then when we start going even deeper, because when I talk about pediatric populations, we're talking about a lot of people, male, female, adolescents, toddlers, everything in between, kids on the autism spectrum, all of these different subpopulations that we really need to be digging into, because we can't generalize from just a generic pediatric population, birth through 18, male, female, all different backgrounds thrown in together. We can't be generalizing across those groups. We need that specificity. And so that is why it is so critical that we do this work, because we have to start quantifying this. It's not just to legitimize the field, not that it's not fun, to be able to go in and say, look, we have this published study that says it does this much in this many days and, and has this effect. That's fun to do. But we need it to better inform our practice. We need it to better inform our educational programs. We need it to take the field to the next level, and also so that we have better effects on our most vulnerable population, on these kids that we're treating. All of us were formerly kids. Many of us work with kids, have kids in the home, teach parents of kids. We can't separate this field from a pediatric population. So we need to get this better information so that we can go into it with more of an informed practice, so that we can achieve better and safer outcomes, which I'll point out is the polar opposite of that whole message of we shouldn't be researching on children because it's not safe. Researching on children makes it safe. Collecting this information makes it safe. Otherwise, we just have a whole bunch of guinea pigs in a big uncontrolled study, and we're never improving or taking steps in the right direction. So the first one we're going to talk about today is a very particular study on a subgroup of a pediatric population. And this is one that I'm really excited about. It builds on some previous work that we conducted. And we're taking a different approach. Most of what we see in the literature, and probably most of what you've seen in your training or in any of the practice that you've done, anything in the field, we tend to kind of look at essential oils and we look at using them for the chemistry or the psychology. And here we're going to start kind of merging the two for this particular study. And this is important for this particular population. Those of you who work with kids with autism or are close to kids with autism, you know that these kids have hypersensitivity to sensory exposures. The steam on their socks will ruin their day. The bright lights, a new sound, a new smell can disrupt their day. It can actually make things worse, not better. They have this hypersensitivity, which means that all of our typical rules are not going to apply. We can't just take our regular information and say, this is the dose that works for this particular essential oil and hand it over to these kids who have completely different experiences with these sensory exposures. And there we go. I conducted a study previously looking particularly at this population, the pre-procedural anxiety population, so just a regular checkup visit. And in that study, kind of just setting some framework here, one thing that we did was we chose bergamot instead of lavender. And the reason for that is it's very, very difficult to find anyone who does not already have some scent memory association with lavender. Most of us have encountered it at some point in our lives and have some sort of subconscious, even if it's a small association, we've got something back in there. And kids are very friendly with citrus oils. Those are typically seen as some of the safer oils to be using. And bergamot, I like to say, is kind of like lavender and citrus had a baby. So you get kind of those lavender effects with that citrus smell. It's just one of my favorites when starting out with kids. So that was the approach here. Something that is not going to trigger any scent memory, but something that will kind of mimic what we're already doing with the lavender. And we used it for kids when they went into a medical office visit. And what we found was the effects varied dramatically. Some of the kids were calm. It immediately helped calm them down. They were so much better. Some of the kids went the other direction. Some of the kids kind of went off the charts. They were much more anxious. Their heart rate went up. They were much more agitated. The visit was much worse. And when we sit down and are analyzing the data, that hypersensitivity issue comes back up. So they're already in a potentially unfamiliar place. There's bright lights. There's noises. They might hear another child crying down the hallway or, people running around, machines spinning blood, whatever is going on. There's differences. There's new things. And then we basically, as I was saying to Laura, we took someone who's juggling 8 balls and we handed them 2 more. Some people can manage that. Some people, that's it. That's enough. I'm done. And so what we realized here was we really have to take this back to the drawing board. We really have to go back to how it is that essential oils work. Because when we look at using lavender or bergamot, do they work through the chemistry? Do they work through scent memory? Do they work through a combination of the two? We don't actually know. Those are rhetorical. We haven't done those studies. But we have that connection there that's undeniable. We have that link there. And so here we kind of are taking a step back and saying, okay, we know that anxiety and stress are psychological outcomes. Scent memory is a psychological process. If we ignore the chemistry part of it, which I know is a sin to say in this room, but if we for a minute ignore the chemistry part of it and look at these psychological effects, and we focus exclusively on priming scent memory to a particular aroma, can we then create something that we can use as an anti-anxiety tool? So this trial was essentially looking at what we can have essential oils do with the psychology of the body that would have physiological outcomes. So we used a completely different essential oil blend, making sure that we had a brand new aroma with no prior scent memory. And we still kept it citrus focused. And then we focused on priming the kids first. So the whole thing was built on that personal subjectivity of scent memory. Setting these kids up with what we can basically trigger psychologically. And this is particularly important when we're talking about kids, because as we all know, scent is one of the earliest sensory experiences to mature. It's one of the earliest sensory experiences that we start establishing those connections, and we know that link with memory and emotion. So if we were to kind of circumvent all of the naturally occurring scent memory that we all just experience on our own and manipulate it a little bit, can we actually create something where we can then enable people to self-soothe with an essential oil based purely on the psychology of it, still using oils that we know have chemicals in them that are calming. So still pulling upon that a little bit. We're not just completely neglecting it and using any random scent, but focusing in on that scent memory component. So we had 60 kids in this study. All of them had an autism spectrum disorder. They were all relatively middle to high functioning. So they were verbal, they were able to provide information. They were able to respond to the different assessments that we needed them to respond to. And they were age 6 to 11. For kids on the spectrum, that's an age I like to focus on when we're doing these studies, because they're old enough to be giving some feedback, especially the higher functioning kids, so we can get some of that feedback directly from them. Because when we're talking about anxiety or stress as an outcome, parents can assess toddlers and we can say they're acting stressed, they're acting anxious. How much of that is us projecting and how much of that is truly what they're feeling is not going to be 100% match. So here we're able to get it directly from the individuals experiencing it, directly from the patient. They're also not quite old enough yet, though, that they're going to start having outside influences kind of influence their response to using an essential oil or something like that. And then they're also going to not have, again, so many of those scent memories already primed. They're still at that age where we can potentially create scent memories that are lifelong, that they can use for decades to come. So that was the goal here. So phase one, it was a two-part study because first of all, we have to prime the scent memory. So we have to create this environment where they are creating these positive memories and linking them specifically to that aroma. So for the first phase of the study, which was 3 to 4 weeks, then they had it in a roller ball. So the parents could administer it as they are engaging in one of their favorite activities. So puzzles, dinosaurs, whatever that might be, whatever the topic was that was the most soothing and the most calming at the time. And they would just rub it along the jawline on either side, just once, but every single day. The catch here, because we are really trying to form these connections, is that it can't have taken place when they were doing something else that was either distressing, so something that they did not enjoy doing. We wanted zero sad or stressed emotions associated with it, or anything else with any other aroma. So it couldn't be before, during, or after mealtime, before, during, or after bath time, any of those sort of activities. So literally just their happiest moments of the day, exposing them to the oil, it then, dissipates. So we get just that brief exposure where we can create that connection. So we did that. Then we did a 5-day washout period where we just went about life as normal. And then what we did was bring it back out. And we did this during the most stressful time of the year. Any of you who have, again, worked with kids on the spectrum or have kids on the spectrum, you know that the holidays are miserable. There's schedule disruptions, there's new people, there's activities you have to do, there's trips you have to take, there's presents you have to, it's just a lot. It is a lot. And that's where you're going to have a lot of those naturally occurring meltdowns. And I wanted to have the naturally occurring meltdowns here versus the artificially induced, because I wanted to eliminate all of those other factors, the bright lights, all of those other things we couldn't necessarily control. The holiday components are enough of a naturally occurring stress inducer. It's also a more universal experience, whereas each medical practice and office is going to be a little bit different. You're going to have a lot of variation there. So I wanted to really strip this down to something reproducible, something practical, something that could be used by just about anyone in the home. So after that 5-day washout period, what we did was the parents started using it on a rescue as needed basis. So during these 2 weeks, around Christmas, before Christmas, around New Year's, that kind of general vicinity, Thanksgiving, any of these winter, December-ish holidays, then pulling it out and during a meltdown, applying it the way that they did to bring them mentally back to their favorite activity, that memory that they had, that calming activity that they had. Now, the parents could do this up to 3 times a day. And then we did track if they had additional meltdowns afterwards. We capped it at 3 because we didn't want the smell to just permanently be there. And we definitely didn't want to accidentally retrain that sync memory so that now it's associated with these miserable time of the year. We wanted to have that positive association and then use it as needed. And then they did that for up to 2 weeks. So we looked at total usage among each of the kids. We also looked at pre-post test using the STAI, which is the State Trait Anxiety Inventory for Children. It's very short, simple questions because it's important with data collection, especially with psychometrics, that when you're collecting data, you don't accidentally contribute to a change in the outcome. So if we have a kid that's having a meltdown and we suddenly need to sit them down and ask 25 questions, that's not going to work. We're going to agitate them and we're not going to get good data. They're going to start just, either refusing to answer or just answering middle to the whole thing. So there's respondent fatigue we have to keep in mind. So we have to go really short. We have to go really simple, but we need to extract data here from these kids. We also have a mood scale that we used. And then at the end of it, we also collected subjective feedback. And this is basically sometimes where we get the most gold in a study. Because it's the questions you didn't think to ask. You're basically just saying, I'm a wide open slate. Tell me what the kids said to you unsolicited about using this oil. Tell me what you thought unsolicited about using this oil. And especially when you're researching on kids, you get the best information here. They will tell you that oil is stinky. They will tell you, I don't like it. They will tell you it smells hot. It smells they come up with the most creative words to provide that feedback. So you get really good information there too. You also can find out things like when they start asking for it. When can I have my smells again? When can I have this? We even had a couple of instances where kids would start to have a meltdown and then say, I need my smells. So they would start to kind of shift over to that. That is where you really see we're not only getting this objective outcome here, but we're getting something that's strong enough that you're noticing it, that it's happening. So what we have is that on average, they were using the blend about 16 times per child. We had very few instances where the parents actually had to use it 3 times a day and then ran out of opportunities to use it. So that was good. The most exciting part is none of the kids actually had that juggling 8 balls experience. So we didn't have any where adding the essential oil to it actually increased the anxiety. So that was exciting to see. We had a few with minimal effects, but most of what we found was that they began asking for it. Even in the control group, we had kids who began asking for it because, again, just about anything aromatherapy related, the ritual is also providing an element of a placebo effect. So we always see a little bit of that in a control group as well. So both groups were asking for it. They were much more likely to request the oil, about twice as likely to request the oil when they were in the aromatherapy group. They were also in the control group a lot less likely to report any reductions. So again, we didn't see people getting worse, which is an accomplishment when you're dealing with kids having meltdowns who have hypersensitivities. That's always good when you're adding a sensory exposure and it's not getting worse. But we did see reductions in both the mood scale and in the state trait anxiety scale. So we were seeing actual improvements. So what we figured out here is that we can take this oil blend and we can train in just a matter of a few weeks. We can train the brain to associate it with these calming effects and then essentially create our own self-soothing tool using essential oils. Now for generalizability, again, the oils we used are oils we also know chemically are calming. So we were really testing the scent memory component here. I wouldn't think if we were to swap out those oils though with something, very dramatic or very bold that we would necessarily get the same effects. We can certainly try around with other blends, but the important component here was that it was a brand new oil. We know those chemicals are calming, and that we were able to actually create this scent memory effect that we could then control and then use as needed in one of the busiest high stress times of the year. So that was that study. I do have, though, a few minutes. So I want to kind of take you into what we have just started working on as well. It's another study on children again. And as I mentioned, a big thing that we like to do is really kind of push the bar. Again, digging into some of these questions that aren't necessarily highly profitable. They're purely for education purposes and purely to help the field advance. And so this one, we're diving back into lavender essential oil. But we're breaking away from that stress, anxiety, pain, pre-procedural component and diving more into that miscellaneous section where we don't have a lot of good information. But we are sticking with the lavender for a couple of reasons. One of them is because it is the most commonly oil used in children. It just is. It is, despite the prepubertal gynecomastia arguments that, as Jennifer said, still linger out there. We still see these popping up from time to time. We know that it does not contribute to prepubertal gynecomastia through that extensive study that we conducted. So I like continuing to use things that we've established to be safe, kind of building upon that science and taking it to the next level. And again, it's also one where it is commonly used, which I know I mentioned earlier means we all have some scent memory associations. But for this particular study, we're taking things a completely different direction, and scent memory does not matter here at all. It does not play a role here at all. We're looking purely at first aid. I'm just going to pause a second here and read the room. Yeah, it says that. We are evaluating it in real world circumstances, the way that actual people are using essential oils on children. Not the way we all pretend that we're using them on children or the way that we all politely say that we're using them on children. We're evaluating the way they're actually used in real life, because this is what's happening in real life with children. And I do want to give a little bit of scientific justification for that. A lot of our concerns with high concentrations of essential oils are based on borrowed toxicological data from the cosmetic industry. And if we're creating cosmetic products, if we're creating lotions, if we're creating daily products, absolutely that is the most appropriate way to get that information. But if we're looking at something medicinal, if we're looking at something that we're using for first aid or that we're using to accomplish a medicinal outcome, toxicological standards are different. We have different requirements, we have different guidelines. And we can go through dozens of examples of this. The coffee that many of you have sitting in front of you contains caffeine. And if we look at the amount of caffeine a human can ingest on a daily basis versus the amount of caffeine that would contribute to acute toxicity, we have dramatically different numbers because the body metabolizes it and eliminates it, and we can have more. In a year, we drink caffeine that's enough to kill us, but we drink it over the course of a year versus in one day. It works the other way as well. When we're looking at things such as contaminants in water, if we are going to have an amount that we're exposed to on a daily basis, that can build up in the body versus the amount we can tolerate in a single dose that then the body can move on. So we have different standards. The two are not interchangeable in any way, acute and chronic toxicity or not. We also have a little bit of a higher tolerance for discomfort and for adverse effects when we're looking at a medicinal outcome, because the bar is higher. If we're looking at a lotion that we're going to be applying in a spa, there better be no discomfort. It better be purely relaxing. But if we're looking at a cough syrup, we kind of expect it to be disgusting. In fact, there's actually psychological studies that show if it tastes good, people don't think it works. So we have this difference in our expectations. So there's a little bit of scientific justification for using the oil neat. Also, again, this is the way it's being used. So we need to have information and data on the way that it's being used, not this ideal that we have created. Now, in this study, we do have 3 groups. So we do have a high dilution where we have something more along the lines of what we tend to see in skincare guidelines. And obviously we have a control that is just a placebo so that we can compare. So we will be able to look at this and see when we use it neat, do we get better results than when we use this dilution? And are both of them different from nothing? And this is particularly relevant when we are looking at cuts and scrapes and wounds and injuries, because the medicinal alternative here is typically over-the-counter Neosporin, which once upon a time was just the thing that everyone would grab and put on everything. But we now know through post-market research that, first of all, it causes contact dermatitis. It's more likely to cause contact dermatitis than lavender, even neat. So we're actually using something safer than what the conventional standard is, even though we're doing something that's a little bit shocking to some of us in this room. We also know that it contributes to antibiotic resistance, which, as we've all heard over the last couple of decades, is a huge problem across medicine. So anything we're doing that's contributing to antibiotic resistance is, if we can find a replacement there, that's ideal. And then we've actually learned that it increases wound healing time. It doesn't actually make things heal as quickly as we've necessarily been led to believe. In fact, most organizations are now recommending using just pure petroleum jelly on cuts and scrapes for little ones. Again, I'm reading the room. So we're looking for something that's better. And when we look for something in the aromatherapy world that's better than something that we know is causing contact dermatitis, that we know is contributing to antibiotic resistance, that we know is not ideal, we're looking for something safe, natural. Where else are we going to go but lavender essential oil? I mean, that's the Sunday school answer. That's the first choice. So what we're doing for this study, and it's just kicked off, we're collecting 200 children, ages 2 to 12. So toddlers all the way up to the cusp of the teenage years. Really primarily trying to capture kids who are still active and falling and scraping their knee and cutting their arm and those activities, because what we are hoping to collect here is, researchers sometimes say the worst things. When we're conducting immune studies, we're hoping to collect sick days. For this study, we're hoping to collect cuts and scrapes because that's the data that we need to have. It sounds horrible, but we're looking at naturally occurring cuts and scrapes. Those are the data we want to collect. So any of those that happen for these kids during that 90-day period, we're going to collect that information on them. Obviously, anyone with a known allergy or any underlying health condition is excluded. So these are otherwise healthy kids, physically active, robust kids that are likely to fall down and scrape something or run around outside and scrape something. And when that happens, then they'll already have been enrolled in the study. The kids will have provided informed assent. The parents will have provided informed consent. They already have their materials. They will obviously wash it. There's a sticker that they put around it that tells us the size of it, and they take a picture of it. So we have a visual of the baseline. And then they apply 1 drop of the assigned product. 30 minutes later, we also take a baseline pain scale because we do that. 30 minutes later, we'll do a follow-up pain scale to look at immediate pain reduction. And then we'll get imaging again at 24, 48, and 72 hours. And then we follow up again at 7 days, where we're looking for complete resolution of the scrape. And we're also going to collect data on if they had any need for any sort of rescue medication, if it became infected, or if they needed to do something different, and any potential scarring as well. So we're looking not just at wound healing time, but across the board, comfort levels, discomfort levels, scarring, all of these other factors that are related with these routine childhood cuts and scrapes that we see. The application of the oil is 3 times a day for the first 72 hours. So basically morning, noon, and night, whatever time the scrape or cut happens, you kind of pick up from there and you do it over the next 72 hours. So 9 total drops. That's it. Then they're done. So again, that keeps us in that acute exposure phase. We're not doing neat oil application for weeks or months on end. We're doing these 9 drops during this particular period in time where we are actively collecting data to see what we can find. So there's our list of our primary and secondary outcomes that we have. Again, the pain scores, time to complete healing. At day 3, we're going to measure the percent reduction, looking at how quickly it takes. And then obviously the scarring and the rescue medication. So that study is just kicked off. 200 kids is obviously a lot of kids. We do have it set up with the randomization process where there can be multiple kids in a family. So that does help. And they all get randomized to the same group. So the moms don't give somebody the wrong one. We know to make it easy on the moms. But 200 kids is a lot. And then each of them, participating for 90 days. But again, the goal is because there's going to be kids that don't have any cuts or scrapes during the 90 days. We will get some really careful kids. We're hoping a little bit more for the rambunctious kids though, because that gives us more of that information that we can then pull together and that we can measure. But when the study is completed, then what we'll have is not just, oh, here's an essential oil that you can use instead of Neosporin or instead of a triple antibiotic cream, but we'll have safety data on it, additional safety data that we can add to all the data that we already have about lavender, again, showing no connection with prepubertal gynecomastia. So we can have that whole separate study that we add in there. But also information about neat use versus diluted use. Some of these lingering questions that have been arguments and conversations and entire topics of internet back and forth forever, we'll actually have information on it showing they healed this much faster with the higher potency, or they didn't. We don't know, but we'll have all of that information so that we can then create more precise safety guidelines, more precise dosing guidelines, and then we can build from there and continue improving these outcomes for all of the kids in our practices, all of the kids in our homes, all the kids exposed to what we're doing. So the takeaway here is, again, there's a lot of garbage out there. We don't want to see the garbage. This field is better than that. We have valuable tools out in the hallways that we can use to achieve incredible outcomes. We have case study after case study collected in databases like the Case Study Collaborative, other databases where we see these are things that are happening. We can pull this together and we can really quantify it with the right methodology. We just need high quality studies, not necessarily more studies, higher quality studies, good studies that we're putting out there. And we definitely need studies on these groups that are being neglected. Kids on the autism spectrum. And then even, being able to subdivide with 200 kids. If we get enough of these injuries, we'll also be able to subdivide that and see, is it different for little girls than little boys? Is it different by geographic region? Does climate play a role? Does race play a role? Does overall health, all of these other factors, depending upon what we get, we can evaluate how things might need to shift or be different for different subpopulations within that general pediatric population. But the only way to do that is through more and more of this good, high quality research where we get these good data sets that we can pull all that information out of.